All right, we're back. We are Game 1014 in the winter 2017 semester, and we are week 7, part 1 of our broadcasts today. A couple of things administratively I got to talk about is next week is off. We're off next week for our mid-semester break, if you will. And then the week we get back, that's around week 8, officially week 9. I don't know how you want to say it. Calendar week 9, teaching week 8. All right, if that makes sense, right? So not next week, but the week after, we have our exam, our midterm exam. Okay, the midterm exam will be on the material that I've presented to you thus far when it comes to all the little piece parts from the book, right? So if I haven't presented something from the book, then it won't be on this test. I may do another quiz or something else later on to hit that. But for the most part, it'll just be your midterm exam will happen not next week, but the week after, okay? And I think that's in line with Alex's sections as well. All right, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our milestones and deliverables, right? So we talked already, we've already done our first playable, and it, like it says here, is the first major milestone for the game. You know, it contains the, basically it's based on the prototype. It's pretty rough. That's what I was expecting for the first playable. Now we're coming to our alpha. Alpha was supposed to be the week we got back from break, but it wouldn't be that week now. It's going to be the week after, right? Because we're going to do our exam when we get back, right? So if you look at the schedule again, just to go back there, and I keep bringing the schedule up every time, but only because I want to make sure that everyone is good, right? So that no one is like surprised when this stuff happens, right? So if you look at the schedule again, right? Here we go. You can see that the week 9, calendar week 9, or lesson week 8, whatever you want to say it, that's when the alpha was due, right? That's when the alpha was due. We're moving this to week 10, or calendar week 10, or lesson week 9, whatever you want to call it. So that'll be the week after. Because we're moving our midterm, the midterm was supposed to be this week, but we're moving it till when we get back from break, okay? So now this is the third time I've said this. Ray, are you good? Ray? Are you good now? All right. So that's when it's all due. So everyone's clear on the midterm. There will be a midterm. Okay, for people who are confused, there will be one. Okay. So this week, what I wanted to do is I wanted to really talk about your, these milestones deliverables, just to go over them again, because I've had a bunch of questions. I guess you guys had this last semester, but I wanted to bring it up again so people understand what this is all about. Again, an alpha. It's a milestone. It's your assets should be 40 to 50% done by this point for an alpha, like it says here. Everything else could be placeholders, right? You're definitely playing in debug mode, which means you're going to see some debugging information on the console, right? For web games, I can go to the console and see some debugging information. That's okay, right? There might be some other features we're going to change after that point, right? But I want you to take the playtesting results from today. That's why I'm talking about this, right? Because I'm going to give you your playtesting results by the end of the day today. We just did our little playtesting class. And you can incorporate some of that as feedback for your game. You might already know this stuff is coming, but it's good to get feedback from the other teams. And hopefully you guys have been as honest as you can be when we share the feedback. So that way, you can help. All we're doing is we're trying to help each other here in the class by just having the opportunity to play each other's games. So that's really what's happening when we get back, alpha, right? Following that, we have a code freeze. And like it says here, there's no more game code that's going to be added at this point, right? All we're doing from that point forward is fixing bugs. That's what's happening on the code freeze. This is just a review of what you already know, right? So no additional features, just critical bugs are being fixed, and you're identifying them. And that's what you're going to be doing from the code freeze until you get to beta, right? Your beta release is kind of like the next time that things are a little bit more playable, all right? So that means your art, design, all that stuff is ready to go. You fix as many bugs as you can possibly see. You're probably going to we're going to do another round of testing at that point, right before beta again, right, to see where you're at. So this first, if you notice the test on the top, this document that I gave you, your playtest document, we're going to go back to this again. We're going to do this another time, right, this activity. And the reason why is I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to see the kind of the development of the game, right? So again, no new features again, no changes. That's really important. And any kind of bugs that are being identified at this point are going to be something that you're going to work on to fix. And that means every kind of bug. That's not just a bug in code. That could be a bug, a buggy asset. It's not really quite working for you, or sound that's not quite, working for you, or a user interface that's missing something, or anything like that. It could be anything from a visual or auditory element to, an actual functionality piece. For example, you still might be doing your build out for your levels, right? By your alpha. So I'm telling you this, I know people have multiple levels, and who's going to have multiple levels that are individual? I think, James, you're one of the only ones, right? What about you guys? Are you going to have like multiple levels, or is it going to be maps? So that's pretty much, if you notice what it says here, by your code freeze, that's it, right? Alpha, you've got 40 to 50% of all your maps, assets, everything done by your alpha release, right? So then by the time you hit code freeze, right? And again, just from a scheduling perspective, let's bring that one back up. Code freeze happens a couple weeks after, right? So if your alpha is week 10, your code freeze then theoretically should be week 13, right? Or week 12. Week 12, because that's when your alpha would be week 12. And I'll keep you guys abreast of this as well. I'll update you guys as we get closer, and I'll tell you code freezes next time, right? Now notice that there's an alpha and there's a beta and then there's a code release, right? So what's really happened is you've already presented to me once during your playable release. You're going to present to me again during alpha phase, right? I'm not expecting a presentation during code freeze, all right? Because that's just, you've frozen your code, now you're fixing bugs, right? But I will expect the presentation at beta. This will be your rehearsal, right, for your final. And so what I'm looking for is really these two, your beta and your code release will almost be identical, I'm hoping, by that point. All you're doing is pitching your game by the end. The final release, when you do your final release or whatever the release candidate's going to be, that's going to be your final presentation where I'm going to really, there's going to be more of a mark around that. Okay. So if I go back to this for a second, so this is your beta. So code release candidate, and sometimes it's called RC. We say it's a release candidate 1. You might have multiple release candidates, but really when you're release candidate, that's what you're really going to show me at the end. Release candidate. Is it going to be done 100%? May not be. I'm saying from a real world perspective. And we'll talk about the stuff that might be missing today, right? But things like, you've already tested it thoroughly by your first release candidate, I would say. It's like it says here, it's ready for QA testing, and that kind of thing. And it's something that you might want to send off, to things like, if you're going to send it off, you might send off a demo. Between beta and your code release, it's a good time to send off your demo to marketing and to other departments, right? Now, this is in the document, and I brought this up, and I kind of left this up here too. I'm not going to read through this, but this is a good example of what's to be done for people who are questioning it. I'm not sure if you had this slide or these slides already, right? But I'm presenting to you again just because people are kind of still loosey-goosey about what's going where and when it's all happening, okay? Well, let's get into this today. Any questions around your releases and your release schedule, right? Because every time you go through the release, think about this course and the other course, Game Production 1, as your capstone project for this year. You're going to be generating a game, a 2D game by the end of the year, right? The end of semester pretty much, right? And this is your first game that you made for your project. Next year, you're going to have another one like this, right? And it's going to be probably 3D, if I'm guessing correctly, right? Right, or Unity, maybe Unity 2D or 3D. I'm not sure what it's going to be. But at the end of the day, the great thing about this is this whole process that you've gone through, you're going to repeat again. It's going to be rinse and repeat. And the great thing about that is if you make a mistake with this whole process, hopefully you'll keep your teams together. I highly recommend that. Keep your teams together if they're working. If they're not working, you may not want to keep your teams together, right? And there's some groups or group that has a problem with that, right? But for the most part, you want to keep people together so that way you learn and you grow as almost like a pseudo company, if you will, if you think about it that way. Any questions around the release schedule or the exam? Because again, it'll be a multiple choice, true, false type of exam. I'm going to be sharing some of this stuff with Alex. So Alex's exam will be very similar. We're going to have a base of questions that you're going to get, right? Some similar questions that some of the other students in the other sections would get. I'm going to add my own questions. It's going to be from the book as well as GitHub, right? We're going to talk about GitHub as well. And remember, for GitHub, you need to know how to do a commit, right? What a commit is, the reasons why you use GitHub. I think I'd probably ask you those kinds of things.
How you do the commit?
Well, if I give you a scenario, and if I ask you something like, when would you do your commit? That might be a better question.
Okay,
like,
as opposed to list the executable requirements to accomplish.
I don't think I would, because everyone, I mean, I would have to base it on a particular IDE specifically to be very specific, or command line. And I don't expect you to use any specific IDE at this point. You should know the general idea of how to do it. Your engineers should know exactly what they're doing.
Yes, but in the group,
right?
say ours, there's 2 of them who are experts.
Right.
The rest of us go, how do I do this again?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect everyone to know the nitty gritty about GitHub.
Okay.
I just expect you to know the general concepts of how to use
So
GitHub
we
at this
follow
point.
that video and say, oh, okay,
Yes.
makes sense where there's a major change.
That's
and I
all.
can do that,
That's perfect. You know, what you just said is perfect. So when would you make a change? Just to review this, because we're going to talk about GitHub, right? First of all, as soon as I start my project, I'm going to commit to GitHub and make an initial commit, right? And I'm going to have a master branch. The idea of branching is I have a master branch where I keep all of my code, right? This is the basics that I'm going to ask you about in next week, right? So then what happens is you're going to make your initial commit, and we're going to compare your project on GitHub according to that first commit, right? So as I change stuff, and that means if I add something new, a feature, I'm going to do a commit. If I do any kind of bug fixing, I'm going to do a commit. I'm saying these are just general things. Most likely, I'm going to do several commits throughout the process. Like I'll tell you, when I code, I commit and commit often. And not because I want to be difficult. I can always go back. If something broke, I made something, it didn't work, what did I do? I go back. Or I can at least compare. You can do a diff, a comparison between basically the last commit you did and your current code base, and go, oh, I changed this, and that's what broke my code. And that's what I do a lot. So I commit often. Now, I may not push to GitHub until I get out of my chair and go to the washroom, as an example, or until I go to lunch break, or if I go for a coffee break or something, I'm definitely going to push to GitHub, right? But again, nothing's wrong with pushing often. If you want to push every time you commit, you can do that as well. There is no golden standard for this, but I recommend, at least if you're working in a coding house somewhere, or you have your own little company, that as soon as you take a break, you push several times a day if you're working on a project vigorously, all right? And the reason for this is because here's something that happens with coders just in general, and I want to point this out, and this is just kind of a review for your exam. You kind of lose the flow. I don't know if you noticed this, right? You kind of go to lunch, and you come back, and it takes you about sometimes half an hour to get back into it, right? And the reason for this is because your brain has been disconnected from the code, right? And then as you come back, now you're starting to think about solving your problems again. Sometimes you have a fresh perspective too. That's a good thing. You go to lunch or go on a break or whatever and come back, right? Sometimes though, you can take you up to an hour and a half to get back into it. I'll tell you, it takes quite a bit of time sometimes, especially if you're working on a difficult problem. It's almost like you got to go back and review what you did to progress forward, right? So that's why it's important for you to commit often and push at least every time you go away. Push to GitHub. So committing and committing often can happen local. So there's 2 different types of repositories I talked about before, right? You've got your local repository on your machine, and you've got your remote repository, and it could be on GitHub, it could be on Perforce, it could be on GitLab, it could be on Bitbucket, but somewhere in the cloud or some in a central server location, you have your files that you're going to be pushing to a remote. We do not use Dropbox, all right, and we do not use Google Drive or any other kind of platform as a service, for this kind of thing. Typically, we do not use that. It is not industry standard. You will not get away with using that in the real world. It would not be acceptable. Okay, we definitely use network drives to house our code, yes. But what if that network drive fails? What if your connection to Dropbox interrupts while you're transferring? Anything can happen, and it can cause code corruption and code loss in general. All right, so let's talk about software ratings a little bit. Anyone else have questions around the exam? So we talked about 2 parts. Again, one part would be about the book, and the other part is about GitHub. All right, so I'm going to ask you questions around GitHub, and these questions I'm going to ask you guys is all common sense stuff, right? But there might be a question like this, and hint, hint, I will probably ask you something like, why do we use GitHub, right? And, I asked you about it before. I'll say it again. The three main reasons are backup, right? Collaboration, so sharing with others, right? And version control, being able to step back to a previous version, looking back at different versions. There's also ancillary reasons we use GitHub, like project management. We do things like issue tracking on GitHub, and we can also do things with milestones and those kind of things. But typically, we use other software for that. Yes. Multiple choice, true, false. Okay. All right, but it'll be, if I ask you something, it'll be something that's related. It won't be. I'm not going to make it. I'm going to try not to make it too tricky. So it's going to be like if you've done this stuff, if you've read your book, if you look at the PowerPoints that I've given you so far, and if you have to rewatch the videos really quickly, you'll see all the stuff I'm talking about to date. It's not going to cover anything from last semester. So it's only going to be in the stuff we've talked about this semester. All right, let's take a look. So software ratings. So again, most countries, like it says here, do have some kind of an age rating that's related to software, especially it doesn't matter whether it's entertainment, when you watch a movie, or when it comes to playing a game. And the real reason for this is they want to limit the exposure, to minors, right? Young kids especially, when they see certain things, they sometimes can't differentiate between, illusion and reality, right? Especially since all stories really are a bunch of lies, if you think about it, right? When you actually look at a story, it's not real, right? I'm actually creating an illusion, right? And that's what it is. So whether it's an illusion through film and where we want to communicate something, or whether I'm playing a game, it's still an illusion. It's still not real. And the closer we get nowadays with getting to more realistic human characters and realistic violence, whether both in film and in video games, right? It can really impact people when it comes to playing these games or watching the films. A good example of this is if you ever played Doom. Who's played Doom lately, the newer version, right? It's quite scary sometimes, especially the opening scenes. It can be, now imagine a kid watching that. Like I'm talking like a minor, a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old. They might be really scared. They don't know what's happening, and they might really think that someone actually died, right? You don't know, right? It could also not just affect them, but also other ages. These images, the common saying is you can't unsee something, right? Once you've seen it, it's done. It's seen forever. And it's forever impacting your psyche, the ability for you to process this information is always in there. You might have nightmares. You might have these images pop up again. And for some of us, especially as we get older, we're able to cope with these images. We have the ability for us to process it and understand the difference between reality and fantasy, right? And that's what these ratings are all about. These ratings are all about protecting our children, people who are younger, against fantasy violence, fantasy sexuality, fantasy drug use, the ability for us to glamorize things like being in a gang, glamorize, negative humor, kind of racial issues, mature themes. We glamorize all that stuff in games, and sometimes we bring it up because we want to create a really good villain, and that villain in a story could be realistic, especially if it's human, kind of very human-like character. And the more blood and gore and everything else we add to the game to make it more realistic makes it so that it's difficult to differentiate between, reality and fantasy. Okay, so that's really the reason why we do software ratings. Now, there are strict rules in different countries about this. And in the US, we have a certain standard typically. Now, because we're so close to the US in Canada, we use the ESRB ratings most of the times, right? Because we're kind of partnered with them. But there's other rating systems that are used across the world. For example, in Europe, they use PEGI, and in Australia, they use ACB. And there's other places, for example, there's another system in Japan and in Korea and other places in the world. They have a different setting, a different a rating system that's slightly different from every other place. Germany is a good example of one that does not follow PEGI. They have their own system altogether, and they're very strict, especially about things like Nazi themes. And I'll put it out there for you, right? Violence towards children. There's all kinds of other stuff that they have because of this thing. And it's a very interesting topic. Now, you might think that it's not a big deal, but, and especially it's not affecting you right now because you're making a little 2D game that you're putting up on the web. But eventually, if you actually are successful at being a game developer, this is something that can really be a thorn in your side, because remember that we're producing games right now for different platforms, different localizations, right? And it could go all over the world. And depending on where it's going, if you want to sell your game and be profitable, you may want to enter other markets. And in order for you to do that, this is one of the things we need to do. Actually, that's why this today is all about ratings and localization, those two things, and how we can use both those things so we can be marketable in other countries. All right, so when we talk about ratings, I mean, these are the typical rating scales we see here from a ESRB perspective, where we have, you might see these symbols. So there's iconography aligned with the rating system, right? For example, you know, I see a lot of times the games I play are all M for mature, right? Because I love playing those first-person shooter games, right? Because there's some fantasy violence, there's most likely some kind of gore, and that kind of stuff, especially when you play most first-person shooters, except for probably, I would say, something like, there's still fantasy violence, but take a look at a game like Halo, right? And it's almost like a very cleaned up kind of violence, right? It's a Microsoft game. So you play Halo, and, you know, and just to see, can someone look up for me just as we're going, look at the rating for Halo, the latest version. Let's say Halo 5 Guardians, I think was the last one, right? That they made. Tell me if it's teen or mature, right? For Halo, and I want you to pull it up for a second, right? Is it teen? Okay. So teen means it's down in here. We'll talk about what teen is in a second. What was that?
Bloodless violence.
Bloodless violence. That's interesting to say that. Bloodless violence, or maybe it's not realistic blood, right?
It's, yeah.
It's animated blood. It's not real blood, right? Yeah. Right. And if you look at, someone look up for me any other game. Look up Fallout. That Fallout. I mean, I keep going back to that series, and that's M, right? Because you see people's head blown off, right? It's a totally different thing, right? It's fantastic, but you know, for some people, or look up something else, like for example, Dark Souls, right? Again, that'd probably be I'm pretty sure it's M for mature. Now, typically, we don't see a lot of games with A rating, right? We don't see an A rating. A rating is usually adult only. When we see an adult only rating, that's usually because the game is a mix of violence and sexuality, all right? So there's not a lot of games like this, and there's a reason for this. Not because we don't want to make games that are violent or sexual, but because they won't pass in other countries. And there's no profit in making games like this. I'll tell you, our foreign markets, Asia especially, right, does not condone anything with an A rating, all right? So we have to be, especially in Australia and those places, Australia will just not have it at all. Anything beyond a teen level, I think it's 15 plus, they will just deny it, right? They just won't allow it. Australia is very strict, right? So if you want to make your game marketable across the world, you got to really think about who is your audience and how much money do you really want to make here, right? If you really don't care, right? And if you really want to make the game that you love, and if it's got violence and sexuality and whatever, just know that it may not be possible to ship it to other regions. That's all. All right, so think about your target audience. Again, we talked about really its behavior and actions depicted in the game. I think that's the one I want to focus on. So behavior and actions depicted in the game, right? So if you think about that, things like violence, language, drug use, sex and nudity, criminal acts, all that stuff that's glamorized, we look at all those things to kind of get up, you know, kind of create a rating, right? Now there's a board, ESRB is the board that's going to review your game and produce a rating for you, right? And sometimes they'll give you this thing like not yet rated, yeah. Gender? Oh, the genre, right, yeah. It doesn't really matter. It's not about, if it's a horror game, it's okay. I mean, it can be horrifying, but you're going to, most likely a horror game is going to be into mature and teen, at least, right? Because it's hard for you to take away these scary elements. It's behaviors in the game, right? So if they find it that there's a lot of violence or implied violence or the threat of violence, right? It might move into teen or mature, right? Even though there might not be any violence yet, you might be afraid, and that fear factor might cause them to rate it as a teen or mature kind of game, right? All right. So again, it's all about age appropriateness, but they also have something else. They have something called this content descriptor as well. And a lot of the companies out there also have content descriptor, or sorry, I can say the agencies or the boards across the world have this content descriptor, a lot of them. So for example, we might have E for everyone, but let's talk about Y. And they talk about this as, for example, comic mischief and mild lyrics might be two of the descriptors. For ESRB, there's about 30 of them, right? So it's not just the rating, but also the content descriptors that you would look at for your game to tell you what the problem is, like blood and gore might be one of them for mature, right? And here are some common ones: blood and gore, language, tobacco reference. So even smoking and stuff like that is looked down upon. PEGI, as an example, in contrast, has a few of them. They have 10 of them as opposed to 30 that we have here in the West, right? Violence, fear, discrimination, and so on. Those kind of things are there as well. And there's also a grouping of icons that we're used to seeing for different ratings. And I've given you the ones here, like I said. So example, these are the icons that we might see for the ESRB ratings. And then you're going to have some the content descriptions right here. Okay. All right. So how do they rate it? Right. So when you go to the board and you're going to submit your game, sometimes it's not just enough to give a demo, and a demo means it's going to be at least in beta. We're talking about at this point, right? Or the fully playable game. So sometimes your game might be held up for 10 to 45 days, business days, just on rating, right? Because some companies, for example, Walmart, Target in the States, will not accept a game that doesn't have a rating. So even if your game is done, right, and it's golden, and it's great, they won't sell it for you, right? Costco is another one. So if you want to sell your game in Costco, Walmart, Target, any of those big places, they need to have a rating. And so that it becomes really important to pass the rating board, right? But what if you don't agree? You can appeal in the West for sure. And I'm sure you can do the same thing for other boards. Again, it's going to take you another 10 to 45 days for every appeal to come back with an answer. And you have to have a really good reason why you're appealing. You can do whatever you want. You can appeal as much as you want, but you're just delaying the release of your game. Sometimes they'll tell you that you need to take certain things out that doesn't match any kind of rating at all. And that can be very bad and scary as well. So how can you avoid this? I mean, think about this. We know that these ratings exist. We know that the board is going to come and look at your game and look and try and figure out what kind of behaviors are you kind of creating for your game. But isn't it smart to have a plan ahead of time, right? Who's your audience? I'm aiming for a mature theme. Fine. Keep it low. Make sure that there's certain things that you're going to hit. And then again, depending on how far you want to go, where you want to sell your game in other markets, you may want to even reduce that further. So that's why Halo is a very cleaned up kind of game, because Microsoft made it their kind of, their main, their platform, if you will, or their flagship game. And they're even using the character Cortana for Windows 10, right? The whole Cortana idea, right? Because that's part of Halo. So if you think about all those things, right? It kind of cuts down on some creativity. Some people might, the critics might say, well, there's a creativity issue here, right? What if I want to make my game, it's part of the story to have this crazy villain that chops people up or something, right? Okay, fine, you can have that villain, but just know that it may not be accepted in different countries, right? So these are the kind of things that you may have to give up: demos, game trailers, expansion packs, all those kind of things, bonus content. You have to look at all those things. They have to kind of go to the board, and sometimes each of your DLCs might be rated differently, right? For example, your main game, if I was going to make a main game, it's got, maybe as a rating of mature, right? But maybe your DLCs don't have that rating, or they don't add to it, or it's usually the other way around. Maybe your main game is a rating of teen, but your DLCs, if you add that DLC and now your game's a rating of mature, or because you've added some kind of blood and gore or something else like that. All right, so we talked about this. If your game is released on multiple platforms, you also have to give all the versions of your game. So you can imagine that a game that comes out on both PS4 or all three platforms, let's say PS4, Xbox, let's say, and PC, Mac, right? There's like 4 platforms right there. Usually there's a Mac port, very much like the PC. But sometimes the game, the versions are slightly different, or there's slightly a little bit more realism, especially on a PS4, where you have sometimes a resolution gives you that much extra, punch when it comes to the blood. You see the blood a little bit better, right? And so they might have a different rating for that, and you might be prepared to get some of that stuff back from the board. Again, most boards review things in beta, right? And some of the things they're also asking is for a game that's fully localized. And that means that the game is specific for that market. Example, you're selling a game in Spain, they expect you to have everything translated in Spanish, right? So if you don't have things translated in Spanish, they won't even accept that for PEGI, as an example. It won't make the market at all, right? They won't look at it until it's fully translated, and that means everything from voiceovers to your assets, your music, your themes, everything's got to be translated ahead of time, which means it's a lot of work here just to get your game sold, right? And we talked about this as the different companies won't accept it unless they have a rating. And here's some examples for ESRB. I'm not going to go through all of them, but early childhood, I mean, this will be your target. And this is what I think you should do whenever you make your game, like your game right now. So the group that's in here, Corey and Terry and the guys that are right in front of me here, what do you think your game would be rated if you were going to kind of give it to E for everyone, right? Would you say it's E? Let's take a look, right? So again, the game does not contain anything parents consider unsuitable for young children. You're popping bubbles.
Yeah, but it's also,
right?
At the very current iteration, it's got a blood effect.
There's a blood effect.
To remove that.
Okay, so blood effect means that you probably have mild violence.
That's what I'm saying. We
Right?
have to remove that and make it, happy explosion.
Right. So if you make
Flowers.
bubbles or
Yeah.
flowers come out of the game, right? Just to give you guys, then there's guns, right? Instead of guns, you could have candy canes,
Yeah.
right? Or something else, or
Wizard wand or something.
wizard wands or something else. And it's the same effect. The gameplay wouldn't be affected. It would just be your style of play. Your game would be affected by the assets and all those things. How about that group over here? The group with Fernando, right? How about your game? What would you say it's rated right now? E. No, I don't know if it can be. Is there any kind? But you're fighting. There's violence, right? Whenever there's violence, there's probably you're between an E and an E10 plus, right? So you don't know where it is right now. There's no blood yet, but we don't know, right? And depending on the themes and the background music and everything else, like for example, when you add music or feedback effects like sound later on, and if you heard and some like hits, that might take you into E10 or something else, depending on what it is, right? So these are interesting things. So when you make your game, and this not just for this semester, but for the future semesters that we have together, right? Think about this. Who's your audience? Who are you marketing for? And that's going to affect every choice that you make, from your assets, visual assets, auditory assets, the style of play, the how many lives you're going to give your if you're going to make multiple lives for and score, how do they score? Everything, it's going to affect whoever your audience is, right? So it's really kind of an interesting topic, almost like to work backwards, right? You're working backwards here. You're starting off from the end game, right? What's the end game going to look like? Who's your audience? Okay, now how am I going to build that, right? To make sure that I meet these, as opposed to retrofit, which is a very bad thing. Okay, if you have to retrofit your game, that is horrendous. Yeah.
But wouldn't that sort of limit you?
Yes, it would.
Into the game thinking of your limits.
No, it would 100%. Fernando, that's a great question. The question is, would it limit you? Absolutely, it would limit you, right? But the reason why is because you want to make your game saleable to more people. The lower it is here on the scale, right, it makes it available to more people, right? Now, you might think that it also cuts some stuff off. If you see a game that's E for everyone, sometimes you don't want to play it if you're a teen, because you're like, I want the violence. My friends don't think I'm cool, unless I have a gun, right, in my hand and shooting stuff, right? But on the other hand, anyone can play it. That's the idea. You can give it as a present to anybody, and you're not going to worry about people being too kind of say, I can't give that to my kid.
Nintendo's had a focused business model for almost their entire run with having games accessible for a lot of different people.
Very good, and that's
Sometimes
right.
limitations can even be worked in to make a product more interesting or unique from that. It's easy to make a character swear, but it's harder to make a creative insult that doesn't require swearing. And
I like that. It's sometimes you get raised, and just to reiterate here what's happening on the video. It's true. It's sometimes, when you're limited, when you're put in a box, sometimes it doesn't matter whether you're doing this, any project, any business you're in, you have limited resources. Sometimes you need to use more creative means to do the same kind of things. So I agree with you 100%.
In a box, you got 6 places to draw.
That's it.
I just thought that right now. I hope that it's used.
Here's PEGI. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but they have a different kind of system. One thing to note is that they do not align with Germany, right? So Germany has their own. And PEGI has these standards. So PEGI 3, suitable for persons older than 3. right? PEGI 7, so it's all age-based. PEGI 12, PEGI 16, PEGI 18, right? And
For
different.
international ratings, you want to make sure you keep in mind what the general stuff for those international.
Well, age, and I want you to point out here is if you see this on the exam is the word glamorization, right? That's a big one for PEGI, right? Where I have glamorized crime, right? It's cool to be a criminal. That is a PEGI 16 thing, right? Illegal drugs and all those kind of things is a PEGI 16 thing. Whereas, you know, when you go to PEGI 12, as an example, realistic humans. Once we get to realistic, so it looks like a realistic blood, that's PEGI 16, right? Or PEGI 12. So that's how it goes. So when you look at these things, it's that age and older, right? So 3 and older, 7 and older, 12 and older, and so on. Yes.
We get into costs.
Costs for how much this costs?
Yeah, it does cost.
Oh God! Whenever you start doing this kind of stuff, whenever you start submitting this stuff to different agencies or whatever, it could cost as much as a few $100s or as much as thousands of dollars, depending on which agency you're submitting to. Especially when you're going to Europe and so on, because you have to ship all your stuff out there. So there's a shipping cost involved. Then you have to make them sign off. There's a whole waiver system that you have to sign off and everything else. And if you go to their websites, each of these I'm going to go to the end. Each of these agencies or boards have their own website, and they give you submission criteria. And it doesn't matter how much it costs you. It's a matter of if they get everything they're looking for, right? Or else, you know what? You can't enter that market, which is crazy. That's a big loss. So sometimes what happens is there's a primary market. You might see a different release schedule. And you might say, well, how come they're releasing stuff in you know, the Europe first before here in the States and Canada? Well, because they might have been, you know, they might get a rating already from Europe, and they're still waiting 45 days for a rating in Canada or the US, right? So that's the reason. Sometimes that causes it to be, you know, to be delayed. Or it's the other way around. You get the US release first, and then you see the other ones released a month or 2 months or 3 months or a whole year afterwards, right? Because it takes that long to get kind of a response from these different agencies. Here's Germany. Interesting with Germany, I'm not going to try and pronounce this, Unterhaltungssoftware Selbstkontrolle. I didn't do that properly. But if you notice this agency, the USK, they have suitable for persons older than 6, 12, 16, and 18. And they have a bunch of things related to, you know, to why it's not just an age thing. There's other issues around this. For example, they have descriptors as well. There's one for Australia. Australia is pretty stringent, and this is the real one for that I want you to look at. MA15 plus age restriction. That means children younger than 15 years cannot view or buy the product unless the company or of a parent or a guardian in the company of them, right? And this is a legally restricted classification, and it is against the law for retailers to sell MA15 plus games to anyone underage. Against the law. That means you'll be like, you can go to jail, right? It's a criminal activity, yeah.
What if you're posting something on, let's say, the Apple Store, right? You can't control if someone in another country is.
But you can, because every country has their own app store.
But you didn't pay
right?
for an ESRB, is what I'm saying.
No, you have to. When you make a game for App Store, you have to rate your game, right? And especially if you want it to go to other markets.
Yes, there's individual country markets.
If you want to go to other markets for your game in the App Store, you have to apply to those markets as well. You have to submit your game, especially for Apple. Apple's very stringent, right? It has to meet human interface guidelines. It has to meet all the ratings, and it has to meet all the localization requirements for that country, right? You have to go through that whole process again and again, and you may have to submit multiple times for each of the markets to get accepted. That's why it takes so long and delays your kind of thing. Yeah.
One of the things that I saw was, for example, Pixar, things like this. They would instead of like for movies when they're translating it, instead of like text,
Yeah.
you have images and things from replacing those things. Wouldn't that be something?
And we're going to talk about that. That's very good. So instead of text, some of the options from a localization perspective you're talking about, like language, we're going to talk about in a second. Sometimes we use icons that can speak to everybody as opposed to text. Because text can limit us, so we have to translate all that stuff, right? But icons are universal sometimes, right? And we'll talk about the stuff that works and stuff that doesn't. So one thing that's interesting here is you cannot, if you refuse classification, you can't sell your game in Australia. So until it gets rated, and if it goes beyond MA15, it won't be sold in Australia. So if it's not suitable for someone 15 plus at all, like it doesn't meet that rating, it won't meet it all, which is crazy, right? I mean, it's more stringent, but they're trying to protect people here. That's what it's for. The rating system is there to protect minors, people from viewing something that's inappropriate because you can't unsee what you have seen.
That's one here in school.
There you go. Japan's got their own system and Korea has theirs. One thing is on slide 27, if you want more information for all the ratings boards, they're all right here. Each one of them has their own website, and on the websites themselves, they have criteria on how you can submit. There's also the software publishing associations, which give you criteria that you would follow, especially for things like entertainment, different places in Europe or in specific markets like France or Spain. They have different associations you have to kind of connect with as well to make sure they meet criteria, or else you won't get a good rating. So now you can figure that what, Terry, you said it, like how much cost is involved here, right? Well, yeah, there's a lot of cost, but the most important thing is to have this in your mind in pre-production, right? When you're planning your game, you got to sit there and go, okay, what's our target market? What kind of icons and iconography or artwork that we're going to use? Is it going to be appropriate for kids? And it's got to go through an approval process before you accept the artwork, right? Or even the auditory stuff, the sounds. Like if you hear like things like your character getting hit, depending on that sound, it can also not pass, right? So you got to figure how that works. So you got to be able to give proper feedback so that it's fun for kids, right? And if you're going to target kids at all. And that's why that market is a very tough market, because you got to try and make the game fun for everybody, right? And sometimes it's not realistic enough for some teens, so they won't play that game anymore, but it's just realistic enough for kids. Any questions around ratings? Yeah.
Yeah, how about the content itself? Like what the characters are saying.
All that stuff, any theme, anything they say, anything they do, you know.
I mean like person, I mean like something like maybe the art, like.
Oh, listen. Anything, yeah, anything like that. If they say, you know, they might just say, you know, make America great again. That might be enough, right? I mean, you know, it could be viewed as a slant too nowadays, right? Because you know, you never know, right?
Yeah, keeping an eye on current sort of like stuff going on in regards to how you start populating your game with like dialogue or themes and stuff can be very important to the rating system as well.
Well,
if you start doing stuff like that, unless it's put in as a form of satire, you could get in some.
Even when it's put in as satire, you'll still get in trouble. And the thing to do is this is why game story is so important. You're making a game today about your 2D game, but what's the game story, right? And you got to think about that. And if the game story it's just the story itself is mature, right? That may drive them to put your game in a different category, whether you agree with it or not.
And mature can mean a lot more than just there being violence. And like
violence, sexuality. Mature can mean a lot of different things, like you said. It could be something to do with the story. That's right.
Well, there's a lot of kids for movies for kids that imply all that violence and things like that. If you think about Nemo, it's about like Tyrone getting killed.
Well, that's it. Nemo's a good example of that. Is it for E for everybody, right? Maybe it's G. It's a different rating for movies than it is for video games. Or PG, parental guidance. Might be parental guidance, right? Because they want to try and if the kid is afraid, they say, "Mommy, you know, the whole family died," and then you know, mommy can say, "Don't worry, it's it's just a story," right?
Just STPPs. Skip the prologue, parents.
Let's talk about localization or location issues. So we talked about international markets when it comes to rating, and now something related has come along: international markets when it comes to location, and all the things we need to do. If you thought ratings were bad in terms of money. All right, and Terry, this is just for you, right? You got to think what location-based stuff costs. I'm talking real costs here, all right? This could quadruple the amount of, or even more, quintuple the amount of assets you need to create in order for you to meet markets, right? It's crazy how much it is. An example of this would be, I want to have different versions of my game. I want to have a French version. In Canada, maybe you want to have a French version because, hey, we're a bilingual country, right? If you're going to sell it in Quebec, it's required, right? Actually, if you want to sell it in Canada at all these days, you might be asked before it gets rated to make it a French version as well, right? Especially your text. And there's different. I'm going to tell you there's different progression around this. Almost like I want to think about this as a progressive enhancement for a translation, and we'll talk about levels of translation. in order for you to cut costs, right? There's different levels. Well, let's talk about this. If I want to translate it to French, I got to make all my text French. I got to make my UI French. I'm just looking at French. I want to make any kind of voiceovers French. Any kind of thing that's being said in the game French, right? I might have if I have a manual, it's going to be in French, right? Your error codes got to be in French, all right? I'm talking about all kinds of stuff in French. And also you got to think of this. Does it work for that market? For example, here's something that came out a long time ago. I don't know for the older guys. I'm sorry, Corey and Terry. I'm just pointing to you guys, and for me too. I'm an old guy. But if you guys remember back in the day, do you guys remember this car that was made called, the Chevy Nova, right? Remember that car? All right. So Nova, Hispanic people, it means no go, right? Nova. So here in the West, it was actually a very common story for you guys may have heard of this already. But in the West, it was a very popular car at the time. It was a small compact car, did really, really well in the States, and they sold it as is to South America, and South American things didn't go because the car was called Nova, no go, so they thought it wasn't any good. It didn't mean that. They just never translated the word, right? And now if you notice these cars today, the Honda Civic, as a good example, does Civic really mean anything? No, because if they mean something, you might have a chance of pissing somebody off, right, when you sell it to another market. So they make these kind of generic names for things, right? Because it's easier to translate, and that's one of the things you could do when you can translate it as is because it isn't really a word. Yeah.
One of the things that they would replace, for example, in one of the movies, they were playing hockey passing the drink, and then they replaced it for the international version with soccer.
That's right. So that's a good point. So a good example, and that's Fernando said that is they have a scene, and in the north they're playing hockey, but in another place they're playing soccer. Yeah.
Well, I just read that, like in China, like if you're over here making a game, you want to publish it over there. Like if it has any kind of sushi in it or anything like that, then they change it to like cheeseburgers or something. That's
right, because they don't want sushi in the game. Or in the movie, they want to see American food because that's what they're interested in, right? And so when you think about this, think about the complexity around this. This could be a really complex issue, not just from an art perspective or assets, but also a coding issue. We're going to talk about that as well. No, the code doesn't be in a different language, but for example, how do you save all your localized words and stuff? How do you do that? Do you do it in an array? Do you do it in a database? How do you do that? Do you bake it into your apps, into your arts? What do you do, right? So there's some things from a coding perspective and an art or an asset creation perspective you have to think of. It's different considerations. Here's another one, humor and slang. I like this one. All right, so something that might be funny in our country may not be funny in another country. In fact, it could be insulting in another country altogether. Or people may not get what your reference, so they'll change that completely when they do the voiceover, or if they do the subtitles, it may say something totally different because it doesn't make any sense for them. It might be funny for us or funny for them, but it doesn't make any sense for us. And a good example of that is if you ever, guys, for here in the West, if you ever watch any kind of old kung fu movies, all right, and I'm putting it out there, right? They all got voiceovers. Everything's got, they're all dubbed, and they're dubbed badly, right? Like if you actually listen to what they're saying and what they're doing, it's totally different. And a lot of times they make a joke, but it makes no sense for us, and they keep it completely the same. Sometimes these old movies, right? So of course it might be funny to them, but for us it's funny because they think it's funny, but it's not funny for us at all, right? So I'm just using that as a vehicle. A lot of the movies from other cultures, they have their own humor and their own slang. And a good example is this. I'm a Greek guy, and I visit Greece quite often, let's say every couple of years, right? If I can get there. And when I do, something that seems really funny for them, it just goes over my head. Even though I'm Greek and I speak the language, I don't get the reference, right? Or they might have something that's cultural that I just didn't grab onto. It's the same thing that happens in games and in movies. No. Well, they do someone who's a native speaker and someone who knows both languages very well. Usually there's two ways of doing it. We'll talk about that. One is you do it in-house. You might have somebody in your coding house or a company that speaks the language, and you get them to do it, right? That's the cheap way of doing it. And then the real way is you have a whole set of things, a checklist of things you got to change. You compartmentalize it in a package, a kit, send it off to another company, right? And they do everything. And then when you get it back, you got to check through all of it to make sure it's all changed, right? It's quite an involved process, and it could cost a lot of money, like a lot of money, sometimes half the cost of the game. All right, just putting it out there because like you're changing everything, right? So how do you do this from a code perspective? And I talked about code being one of the issues. I want to make text that's localized. And by the way, if you're coding an app for Android or iOS or even anything else on the web store, any mobile device, you have localization settings in there, an option. And we usually keep them in strings. We never hard code anything, right? So all of your user interface elements, all your text in the game, menus, all that stuff is never hard coded. It's put inside string variables or some kind of data store or something that's being read from, so that way you can easily switch from one language to the other, right? That's how we do it, right? So in order for you to have that, again, it speaks back to your pre-production, right? In your concept. When you start planning everything else, you have to plan for localization. You do it way ahead of time, and now it's part of your plan. It's way easier to do that than rejig or retrofit your entire game for who your audience is and a different market. That makes no sense. Don't make it for only your market. Make it for whatever market you can dream of. Make it ahead of time. But then you might think, oh my God, it's going to take a lot longer to make my game. Yes, it will, but the quality that you're going to produce is going to be a lot different when you have all these checks and all these things that you're thinking about ahead of time. So some questions that you might want to think about is, how are my language assets organized? What about fonts and special characters? How about international keyboards? How are subtitles, kind of presented? And on and on. How are voiceovers done? How many voiceovers do I have? It's pretty crazy. And one of the things they do is they organize language and art assets into these kind of folders, right? Here's an example of a folder that has everything to do with English, right? So you have your English folder where you have your audio, your text, everything, all your assets are in different folders. It's the exact same asset, but it's been translated or converted for that local or locale. So it becomes, for an art manager, people said, well, I'm an art person, or or whatever it's going to be. It becomes way more difficult. That's why you have an art department, right? Because they just don't. It's not just one thing. You're not making one asset. You're making several copies of the same asset to be used across different markets. A lot of times, sometimes you might change an asset altogether, right? You might see one asset in Asia, as an example, and a totally different asset, an Americanized asset for the West, right? Because it makes more sense for us, right? For example, a character might look totally different, right, here in the West than they do in Asia or in Europe, right? So things to think about when you're creating stuff and when you're planning your game. And we talked about Germany. You have to watch the whole references, all the references in Germany. You can't mention Nazis. All those kind of things are out. They won't accept it. There's a lot of things in terms of like you said, violence against children and so on. They won't accept. Doesn't matter what it is, what the story. They won't even have it. If you have it in there, even if you translate it, they won't accept it. It's not an acceptable theme. So we talked about not hard coding assets. Don't hard code any of your text. Store it in some kind of flexible data store, whether it's a string variable that you're switching from one to the other, depending on the location, or so you can switch it when you're making that version. For example, that version is not going to be able to automatically switch. A lot of times, you buy your game in Europe, you're getting let's say, for example, if I buy a game for the Xbox in Greece, it's going to be a Greek game, right? It's not like I can turn on English. It's Greek, right? Because it's hard baked in the particular production, right? It's going to be the same thing for other markets as well. Art assets. One thing to do for the art assets is we make a button, and sometimes we make a button and we hard code it in. We bake it into the button. Don't bake it in. Make it a separate layer that you can swap out that text, the text field itself, the font. You want to change it. So it not only is a different text, but also viewable. And a lot of times what we have to do with text assets is we have to make them larger. We have to give more space in our user interface to accommodate different names, because in English, it might be a very small name, a very small word that we're going to use. But in other languages, it might be a lot bigger. And I'm going to Spanish again. Spanish language, sometimes you have or even German might be the worst. German is like twice the size or 3 times the size of a phrase that you're going to say in English, right? It's much larger because of the number of characters that we use more in English in Germany. So you have to kind of give more space in your user interface to accommodate that, because you don't want the word to mess with your layout, right? Your layout should be consistent, and you should be able to adapt to that new country that you're going to be porting your game for. We talked about VoiceOver. They also have a file naming convention for that. For example, any VoiceOver files maybe have a VO attached to them, and so you can kind of target those VoiceOver files and make sure that they're localized. Yeah.
I believe they asked them something like that. So, like a 3D thing, like, I don't know, like a neon sign or something. Everything has to be everything has to be localized. You cannot just come up with a game, or some fancy stuff comes up where you actually, on top of that asset, when you look at it, there's another piece of text. So you see the original asset, and on top of that, you see the translation. Seriously, right? So, like, for example, because I don't see creating something like an English word, and then you have like an A, for example, something Japanese.
It replaced the whole asset. Replace the whole asset, right, for localization. Sometimes that's the answer. And sometimes they don't do it at all. And we'll talk about levels of localization here, right? International character and fonts. For example, some fonts, and I'll give you some examples here from the book, that are a different character sets. You have to support those as well. The ability for your encode to be double byte enabled, so that you can, and especially go bidirectional, so you can go from right to left as well as left to right from a reading perspective, or up and down depending on the country, right? All that stuff has to be enabled. Also, resolution. You have to watch your text when it comes to resolution, because on TVs and some other displays, the resolution is really, really low, and especially when you get to bigger text, as an example, it can be pixelated and it won't be legible. User interfaces we talked about. You have to make sure that things don't overlap, and you have to give enough space in your user interface to accommodate your code and your text. And like it says here, the rule is 25 to 30% more space than you need, right? Which might make your user interface undoable. And that's why when I come back to it, I might say swap. Sometimes it's a user interface swap altogether. Like you have one heads-up display as an example for here in the West, and a totally different one for in Asia or in Europe, because it's just easier, right, than individually swapping out different things. Same thing with currency formats and icons is a good way, like you said, Fernando, is a good way to use instead of using words, and sometimes made up words. Because that word is never going to change from one market to the other. You may just have to sound it out differently as opposed to translate it, which might save you time. Keyboard input. If you're using keyboard input, depending on the country, you have different keyboard layouts, especially in other countries, like for sure in Greece. We have only 24 characters, example, in the Greek alphabet as opposed to 26. Totally different keyboard layout. And what if you put your movement controls on a certain set of keys that you expect everyone to know, WASD as an example, right? But there, it's totally different, right? It's a different set of controls. And you have to be able to give different keyboard maps. That's another thing. So now going back to Terry's costs, right? Think about all this. I need different keyboard maps. I need different characters. I need different user interfaces. I need different text. I need different voiceovers. I need different maps, different signs, different assets all together that I got to swap out for different countries. This can be massive. It can kill your game, and it might make it so that you can't even localize it even if you wanted it. Even if you wanted to give it to Europe and different countries, just wouldn't happen because you're just not big enough to do it. It's going to cost you so much money until your game starts making money, you can't localize it, right? And that means maybe a retrofit, a remake, or a port for that particular country, and that's where that becomes viable, as opposed to not producing your game and not making any money in your home location, right? All right. Other technical considerations, subtitles, right? Are you going to have subtitles? A lot of times we turn them on when it comes to first-person games or even other kind of games, because we hear things, but maybe you want to support people with other disabilities. They can't hear, but they want to be able to play your game. So you want to make it more inclusive. So you have subtitles. We have to include it there too. So not only voiceovers, but what they're saying has to also be translated, right?
Yeah, what if you can't afford voice, so you need to use something?
I'm saying there's like so much to do, right? Lip syncing. So, you know, you have a character that's saying something in the game, a 3D character, they're lip syncing, and lip syncing, that means the model is actually moving at the same time as something else. Do you change the model now for different, you know, different markets? You may have to. You may have to re-lip sync everything, right? That might be a consideration as well. And a bunch of other things. But I think I've covered it here, and I wanted to kind of understand that we don't think about these things when we make games. I want to make a game. I want it to be fun. You did this exercise today when you play test everybody else's game, but none of these considerations most likely came into your mind. Let's talk about level of localization. Here's the 3 levels that the book presents, and I kind of agree with them. Box and docs. Okay, here's one. So you do your box, the other box, and the documentation. But everything else inside, my friends, is exactly the same. It's English, right? And sometimes you can get away with that, especially if it's a really popular game. So box and docs, right? Where they get you to point to the English words and they translate it inside of your documentation. You need to read the documentation in order for you to play the game, right? Lowest level of localization, I would say, right? And the cheapest amount. Partial localization, right? So for example, you've gone and done the in-game text, but none of the voiceover files are translated because you know what? It's too expensive, right? So partial translation. And this might work well for a market that has 2 languages like Canada, right? Where we have French and English, right? You partially translate it. Some mostly is in English, but it works on the French side as well. Sometimes that won't even work, especially if it's a game for kids or for educational purposes. That won't work at all. Then there's full localization, which is the whole thing, full Monty, if you will. So we have to have a localization plan, and it has to be involved right from the beginning. So when you do your pre-production, it's part of your build. Okay, fine. We built out our assets, and let's say, you know, Terry is my asset manager. Mr. Terry, how's your localization plan come along? Have you, you know, contracted this stuff out as you're creating your voiceovers, as you're making your assets, as you're coding everything? Is it right for Europe? Is it right for Asia? Is it right for Australia? Is it, you know, all these little considerations? So it becomes, it could become a rather huge task. But having a plan like this and having some kind of checklist to say, okay, number of words in my voiceover script, here it is. Number of voiceover files to be modified, here it is. So there's not just the translation, here's the number of words I have, right? And total time of the voiceover is 3 minutes. Well, what is it like when it comes to the, you know, Asian one or the German one or the French one or the other one? Like there's a bunch of different ones, and they might have different times, which means your timing is going to be different between cutscenes. You know, there's just so many aspects, there's so many potential impacts that you could have to your game when it comes to timing, transitions, you know, the way your story is going to be affected, the whole thing. And then here's an example of a localization plan where you have a schedule, and here's an example of when things are going to be done. From a translator, when you port it out, how long is it going to take? And that's why this is done as early as possible. And why? Because you don't want to wait till the end for this, right? You want to get as many of your assets translated that you've approved ahead of time, right? So that way when it comes back, you can have, instead of placeholders, you can have real assets that make more sense. I'm not going to go too much into this. So here's the translators. They're going to probably want a playable version of the game. So as early as the earliest playable version, you can start doing translations, all right? And where you want to probably really do it is with everything else. For example, in your design documents, you want to translate those, especially when it comes to if you're working with other countries. There are some some restrictions when you have a company that's split up over a couple of countries too. For example, let's say you work here and you also have an office in Germany, and you're both working together, right? Sometimes you got to do translations both ways, which is another weird thing, right? So not only are you producing assets, but let's say Germany is producing some of your assets. That's another weird, you know, thing to balance. They're making their translations as well and sending them over to you, and you have to check to see if they're the correct translations, right? To make sure that if you have a native speaker that can kind of look through and test all this stuff. So the producer is in charge of putting together this translation kit, which includes pretty much everything, a full package of voiceovers and everything to be translated. We usually give it away to the contractor, And again, that's one option, or do it internally. And I'm going to kind of go down to, we've talked about this in a couple ways. So here's the two main major development processes. Keep it in-house. Try and translate it on your own. You might have some people, and this is the cheapest way of doing it, by the way. Not the best way. May not be the best way, because if you may not have someone who's fluent in both languages, right? And that's what you need, right? Or, and this is more common, especially in AAA games, outsource everything. You take your stuff, you make it in your language of choice, in your locale, and then outsource it to another company. They translate it and they give it back to you. However, what does this require? More testing. So when we do our testing phase, then you get it back and you got to test through every kind of version of your game to make sure that it meets. And that means having a translator there with you. So you're not just working with, they didn't just send the package off and it comes back and you just, oh yeah, it all works. You can actually sit with the translation team to make sure it makes sense, right? And sometimes that means sending people there to sit with them and say, no, I didn't mean this, I meant this, right, when I wrote the story. And a whole other, grouping of details and complexity. And we come down to this idea of linguistic testing, right, where there's several different kind of tests we need to do. One of them is functionality testing, right? So yeah, it's functional, but now do the assets make sense? They've been translated, they've been changed. The assets have changed now. Is the bounding box different because the asset's a different size? Does the user interface flow outside the lines now because we've changed everything? Does it work on different screen sizes? Like, these are all functional testing parameters, because now you're swapping out your code and you have to test to see that it actually does swap out. Does my German version work perfectly with my French version? Is it the same? Does it fit? Right? And now what does the translator say? Did we miss something? Is it being cut off? Is it truncated here or something else? Lots of other testing involved as opposed to strictly making it for one location. Then there's linguistic testing, which is, hey, is my voiceover working? And by the way, is the lip syncing, is it in sync with what's happening in the scene? Is my scene too fast? Is there still voiceover after everything goes dark because they're still talking? Like, there's a bunch of stuff that we have to do. The timing, the programming has to change to accommodate the location. And there's a big testing, there's a big checklist for testing things out. Here's a good example of that, where we have an English one, a police officer is down, mission failed. And then on the French side, there's the French translation. You can see that it's longer, right? Which means it's going to take longer to say, which means your timing is going to be different, which is going to affect your coding, right? It's going to affect the way you code your scene, right? Any questions around localization and the insanity behind testing? Here's another one, third-party submission, right? So after you've done everything, you want to submit stuff to the US, ESRB. Remember we talked about, you're going to, sometimes they won't even accept it in different places unless it's been translated. This is where it gets affected. You translate everything and you send it off to the agency or the board to give you a rating, and they can't give it to you unless it's fully translated. So it's almost another delay, right? On top of the 45 days or whatever it's going to take for them to give you a rating, it needs to be translated first. And also other things, terminology. Here's something that also has to be translated. Sometimes it's not just when you're translating from one to the other, but also if you're working with other people in the same company but different locations, you may even have to translate things like your error messages, because you're working with somebody else and the error messages have to make sense on their end. Even though it's not fully translated in your game, right? Like your coding I'm talking about, you pump out some error messages to the console or someplace else, but it makes sense in English, but it doesn't make sense in Spanish. And you got to translate those error messages too. So lots of other stuff you have to do as well. And so we come down to the idea of having a localization checklist. These are the final slides, guys, and I apologize for how long this is, but I had to go through this with you. Where the localization checklist is used right from the beginning when it comes to your plan, and you go through it and make sure that everything is hit. There's a couple pages here. Do I expect you to remember this on the exam? Hell no. I just want you to know that there is a localization checklist that you would have, and common sense would mean that you probably include this as early in pre-production as possible. That's it for this one. Any questions around ratings or localization or location, which is what it's called? Right from your book, two very complicated issues. They're interesting issues that can come up in the delay of your game production, as well as the marketability of your game in different markets. Okay, that's it for me. The rest of the session here for the remaining of time, the hour, you guys can stick around and work with your teams. And I'm going to collate the ratings and produce that before you leave. I'm going to put it up on on the board to show you guys some feedback about. I'm not going to put all your ratings together, all your testing, and show you what everyone thinks about your game. Okay? Let's take a short break and we'll come back and I'll show you that information.